In this episode, we turn to one of the most practical working tools in the Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (CRISC) way of thinking, because once an organization starts identifying meaningful risks, it needs a disciplined place to capture them, compare them, and manage them over time. For a brand new learner, the risk register can sound like a simple spreadsheet or a tracking document, but in a healthy organization, it is much more than a list. It becomes the shared memory of the risk program, the place where important exposures are described clearly enough that leaders, owners, and operational teams can all understand what is at stake and what still needs attention. That matters because risks do not stay visible on their own. If they live only in meeting notes, email threads, audit reports, or the minds of a few experienced people, they are easy to forget, misunderstand, or quietly ignore until conditions worsen. A well-managed register helps the organization turn scattered concern into structured awareness, and that makes better decision-making possible. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding what a risk register actually is. The Information Technology (IT) risk register is a formal record of meaningful risks that could affect the organization's systems, services, data, processes, or objectives, captured in a consistent way so they can be reviewed and managed over time. It is not just a place to dump every technical problem somebody notices, and it is not only a compliance artifact created for an auditor. Its purpose is to provide a clear and repeatable way to document what the risk is, why it matters, what conditions are contributing to it, who owns the decision about it, and what is being done about it. In other words, the register turns risk from an abstract idea into a visible management object. Once a risk is recorded properly, it can be discussed, assessed, prioritized, escalated, monitored, and eventually resolved, accepted, or retired with a level of discipline that informal conversations rarely achieve on their own. The reason this matters so much is that organizations usually do not struggle because they lack problems to think about. They struggle because they lack a stable way to keep those problems visible in relation to business priorities. A risk that is obvious during an incident review can disappear from view once operations return to normal, especially if teams are busy, ownership is unclear, or the issue crosses multiple departments. The IT risk register solves part of that problem by preserving a shared view of exposure that does not depend on memory, urgency, or who happens to be in the room that day. It also helps reduce inconsistency because the same kinds of risks can be described using the same logic across business units, systems, vendors, and projects. That consistency allows leaders to compare exposures more fairly and decide where limited time and resources should go first. Without a register, the organization often drifts into reactive behavior, chasing whichever issue is newest, loudest, or most politically visible instead of managing risk in a deliberate and sustained way. It is also important to understand what a risk register is not, because new learners often confuse it with several other records that may exist in the organization at the same time. It is not the same as an incident log, because an incident log records events that actually happened, while the register records exposures that could affect the business and may need management action whether or not an incident has already occurred. It is not the same as an issue list, because an issue is usually a known problem requiring correction, while a risk may involve uncertainty about what could happen, how serious it might be, and what treatment is appropriate. It is not the same as a project tracker, an audit report, or a vulnerability scan result, even though information from all of those sources may feed the register. This distinction matters because if the register becomes a dumping ground for every operational detail, it loses its value as a decision support tool. The goal is not to capture everything. The goal is to capture the right risks in a form that helps the organization understand exposure and act responsibly. A strong register entry usually contains several important pieces of information, even if different organizations use slightly different formats or systems. At a minimum, each entry should describe the risk clearly enough that a reader can understand what could happen, what business area or objective is affected, and why the exposure matters. It should include the main contributing conditions, such as weak controls, fragile dependencies, limited monitoring, poor ownership, or external factors that make the event plausible. Most organizations also record some view of likelihood and business impact, along with the current level of concern under existing conditions, the selected response approach, the status of any treatment work, and the name of the person accountable for decisions about that risk. Good entries also include supporting details such as the source of identification, the date of review, related controls, and any link to audits, incidents, exceptions, or project activity. The point is not to create paperwork for its own sake. The point is to make sure each entry contains enough context that the risk can be managed intelligently instead of becoming a vague label that means something different to every reader. Creating a useful register begins with deciding what kinds of risks belong there and how new entries will be identified in the first place. Risks can emerge from formal assessments, architecture reviews, incident investigations, audit findings, vendor evaluations, regulatory concerns, major business changes, project reviews, resilience planning, or repeated operational weaknesses that suggest a broader pattern of exposure. Not every observation should automatically become a register entry, because that would quickly create a crowded record full of low-value items that no one can manage effectively. A mature organization sets criteria for what belongs in the register, usually based on business relevance, materiality, potential impact, persistence, or the need for management attention. This helps separate routine operational matters from risks that deserve a structured place in governance and reporting discussions. The creation process should therefore be deliberate rather than casual. Someone must evaluate the information, describe the risk in a consistent form, confirm that it meets the threshold for inclusion, and connect it to the right business context before the entry is treated as part of the active risk picture. One of the most important skills in this process is learning how to write a risk entry well. A weak entry is vague, overly technical, or disconnected from business consequence, which makes it hard for leaders to know what they are being asked to care about. A stronger entry describes the cause, the event, and the business effect in a way that is concise but meaningful. Instead of saying that there is weak vendor management, a useful entry would explain that insufficient oversight of a critical service provider could lead to prolonged service interruption during key business operations, affecting revenue, customer commitments, and recovery capability. Instead of saying there is poor access control, the entry should show how excessive privileges or weak review practices could result in unauthorized changes, data exposure, or fraud within an important process. This kind of writing matters because the register is meant to support action, not just documentation. When the language is clear and connected to consequence, people can discuss the exposure more intelligently and make better decisions about priority, ownership, and response. Ownership is another area where the register becomes much more than a record-keeping tool. Each meaningful risk needs a clearly identified owner, and that owner is not simply the person who discovered the issue or the person who types the entry into a system. The risk owner is the person with the authority to decide how the organization will handle that exposure, which means this role often belongs to a business or service leader rather than a technical analyst. Control owners may also be involved because they are responsible for operating or improving specific safeguards that affect the risk, but owning a control is not always the same as owning the risk. This distinction matters because the register should make accountability visible. If a risk has no owner, it tends to drift. It may appear in meetings, remain in reports, and even receive temporary attention, but without a clear decision maker, it rarely moves toward a stable resolution. Good register management, therefore, includes confirming that each active risk has ownership at the right level and that the owner understands what that responsibility actually means. Prioritization is one of the main reasons the register exists, because no organization can give the same level of attention to every risk at the same time. The register helps leaders compare exposures using shared criteria such as likelihood, business impact, control strength, dependency, legal consequence, customer effect, or alignment with critical objectives. Some organizations use simple rating scales, while others use more detailed methods with scenario-based reasoning and broader business inputs. The exact method can vary, But the important point is that prioritization should be consistent enough that the register supports real comparison instead of becoming a collection of disconnected opinions. A highly visible technical issue may not deserve the most urgent treatment if its business consequence is limited and the organization has strong workarounds. At the same time, a quieter issue involving identity services, third-party concentration, or data integrity may deserve greater attention because of the scale of potential harm if it worsens. The register becomes useful when it helps leadership see those differences clearly enough to focus time, money, and management energy where they matter most. Managing the register also means connecting each risk to an intentional response rather than merely recording that the exposure exists. Once a risk is identified and assessed, the organization still needs to decide whether it will reduce the exposure, live with it for now, shift some of the burden elsewhere, or change the underlying activity that creates the problem. The register should show that decision clearly enough that anyone reviewing the entry can tell whether the risk is being actively treated, formally accepted, monitored for change, or considered closed under defined conditions. This is important because a risk does not disappear simply because a project has started or because someone said a mitigation plan is underway. Register management requires visibility into whether the selected response is realistic, whether actions are progressing, whether the environment has changed, and whether the risk remains above a level leadership considers acceptable. In that sense, the register is not only a static list of exposures. It is also a management view of the organization's choices about those exposures and the status of the work tied to those choices. Another critical part of creation and management is understanding that the register should be a living record rather than a document that gets updated only when someone remembers it before a meeting. Risks evolve as systems change, vendors change, regulations change, business priorities change, and controls improve or degrade over time. A risk that was once high priority may become much less serious after architecture changes, stronger monitoring, or process redesign. Another risk may look stable for months, and then suddenly grow more important because a new dependency appears, a contract changes, a key control begins failing, or the business starts relying much more heavily on the affected service. This means the register needs regular review and disciplined maintenance. Entries should be revisited at defined intervals and also when meaningful changes occur, such as major incidents, mergers, new services, third-party disruptions, or significant shifts in business operations. If the register is not reviewed this way, it quickly becomes stale, and a stale register creates a false sense of control because it looks organized while no longer reflecting current reality. The management side of the register also includes closure discipline, which is more important than it first sounds. Closing a risk entry should not mean that people are tired of talking about it, or that a remediation task was marked complete in a separate system. A risk should be closed only when the organization has evidence that the exposure has been reduced, transferred, retired, or otherwise handled in a way consistent with its governance expectations. Sometimes the right outcome is not full elimination of the risk, but a reclassification of its significance because the business context changed or stronger controls reduced the likely harm to an acceptable level. In other cases, a risk may remain open but move into a monitoring state because immediate treatment is not planned and leadership has made a deliberate decision about the remaining exposure. The register needs to make those distinctions visible. Otherwise, closure becomes cosmetic, and the organization loses the ability to tell the difference between a risk that is truly addressed and one that has simply stopped attracting attention. A well-managed IT risk register also supports governance and reporting by giving leaders a clearer view of patterns, concentrations, and recurring themes across the organization. Individual entries matter, but the register becomes especially powerful when it helps management see that several risks share the same underlying weaknesses, such as poor ownership, aging infrastructure, weak third-party oversight, limited resilience, or inconsistent identity control. That kind of pattern recognition is valuable because leadership decisions are often about more than one isolated issue. Leaders may need to decide whether to fund a broader capability, change a governance practice, strengthen oversight of a business area, or elevate a recurring concern to a more senior forum. The register makes those conversations more informed because it brings evidence together in one place. It also helps create stronger reporting for oversight groups, since summaries drawn from a disciplined register are usually more credible than scattered updates from separate teams using different logic. In that way, the register becomes both a management tool and a governance lens. There are also several common mistakes that can quietly undermine the value of a risk register if they are not addressed. One mistake is filling it with too many low-value entries, which makes it harder to see the risks that truly deserve management attention. Another is using vague or highly technical wording that leaves business leaders unsure about what the risk actually threatens. Some organizations struggle because ownership is assigned to the wrong level, which means the named person cannot make decisions about budget, acceptance, or response. Others allow entries to remain unchanged for long periods, creating stale records that no longer reflect actual conditions. There is also a tendency in some environments to hide accepted risks or treat them as resolved, when in fact accepted risks still need visibility, because leadership may need to revisit them if conditions worsen. Strong register management avoids these problems by keeping the record focused, current, understandable, and tied to real accountability and real business consequence. By the end of this discussion, the main lesson should be clear that the IT risk register is not just an administrative list. It is the structured memory and working management record of the risk program, where meaningful exposures are described, assessed, owned, tracked, reviewed, and communicated over time. Creating the register well means using consistent entry criteria, writing clear descriptions, tying risks to business objectives, and assigning ownership at the right level. Managing it well means keeping it current, connecting it to response decisions, reviewing it as conditions change, and using it to support better governance and leadership visibility rather than treating it as a filing exercise. This is one of the most practical habits in CRISC thinking because it turns risk awareness into something the organization can actually manage. When a register is built and maintained with discipline, it helps the business see where exposure lives, what is being done about it, and where stronger judgment or stronger action is still needed.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.